Have you ever met someone who completely changes the direction of your life? Someone who shows up at the exact moment fate needs them to? Well, in A Walk in the Clouds 1995, that's exactly what happens when a lonely soldier returning from war crosses paths with a young woman hiding a life-changing secret. This story is emotional, romantic, heartbreaking, and honestly, one of the most beautiful journeys of love and healing you'll ever see. Today we're breaking down the entire movie from start to finish, so settle in because this is a good one. Alright, let's get into the story. The movie begins right after World War II. Transports are bringing soldiers back home, and among them is Sergeant Paul Sutton. He steps off the dock with one simple dream: to finally start a family with his wife, Betty, whom he married just before heading into battle. He looks around, searching for her face in the crowd. Everyone else is being tackled by hugs and drowned in cheers, but Paul stands alone. Betty isn't there. His hopeful smile fades, and he eventually makes his way to their old apartment. He pauses at the door, touches the locket holding her photograph, and walks in. Betty is inside wearing pale green lingerie. Startled by his arrival, she quickly rushes into his arms. She apologizes, claiming she didn't know he was coming home that day. Paul is confused. He had written to her almost every single day for 4 years, telling her exactly when he'd return. Betty admits she stopped reading his letters because the battle scenes were too frightening. She saved every one of them in a trunk but never opened them after the first few. This hurts Paul deeply, because writing to her kept him alive mentally. But he swallows the pain. He just wants peace and love again. Betty immediately starts talking about the booming economy, and how she convinced Paul's old chocolate company to hire him back. Paul says he doesn't want to sell chocolates anymore. In his letters, he wrote about dreaming of a home filled with children and quiet mornings, letters she never read. But Betty only cares about money and insists he take the job. Paul gives in. By dawn, Paul is already back in his chocolate salesman uniform. He kisses her sleeping forehead and leaves for Sacramento. On the train, Paul notices a young woman trying to wrestle her suitcase onto the overhead rack. It falls, breaking a framed picture. Paul jumps up to help, but the train sways and he ends up awkwardly on top of her. She immediately turns pale and vomits all over his uniform. Paul, being the kind soul he is, tells her it's fine, and heads to the bathroom to clean up. When he returns, he falls asleep and gets hit with war flashbacks. When he wakes up, the woman is gone. He gets off in San Francisco to catch a bus to Sacramento, and by pure luck, he finds the same woman again. She's surprised too. Turns out their tickets were swapped on the train. She introduces herself as Victoria Aragon, a graduate student heading home to her family's vineyard in Napa Valley. Two drunk men board the bus and start harassing her. Paul steps in, his soldier instincts firing, and takes them down. All 3 men, including Paul, are kicked off the bus. As Paul walks along the road, he sees Victoria sitting alone in the middle of the path, crying. She confesses she's pregnant by a professor who abandoned her, and she's terrified her father will disown her if she returns home unmarried. Paul wants to help. He offers to pretend to be her husband for one night, just long enough to get her through the door with dignity. Paul admits he's married, and makes it clear this is temporary. Victoria, desperate and scared, agrees. As they approach her home, the vineyard looks breathtaking, rolling hills sitting above clouds glowing in the sunlight. Victoria tells him her family calls it Los Nubes, meaning the clouds. Before entering, Paul slips a ring-shaped chocolate foil onto her finger and one onto his own to play the part. Suddenly, rifle shots explode through the quiet. Paul panics, but Victoria recognizes the shooter. It's her father, Alberto. Alberto is furious when he hears Victoria announce she's married. The entire household rushes out, the women hugging Victoria with warmth while Alberto fumes. Her mother Marie, grandmother Guadalupe, and especially her grandfather Don Pedro all welcome Paul kindly. Don Pedro even praises his chocolates. At dinner, Alberto interrogates Paul. When he learns Paul is an orphan, Alberto insults him, saying a man with no past has no future, especially not with their respected family bloodline. Paul endures the humiliation calmly and quietly excuses himself for air. Victoria apologizes later, and although Paul is hurt, He understands Alberto's rage comes from protectiveness. That night, their fake marriage earns them the master bedroom. Paul chooses to sleep on the floor out of respect. Later, Marie forces Alberto to say goodnight. He barges into the room suddenly, and Paul scrambles onto the bed next to Victoria, but Alberto clearly notices the blanket on the floor. To avoid suspicion, Paul and Victoria sleep in the same bed. There's a gentle romantic tension between them, but Paul looks away, reminding himself of his marriage. In the middle of the night, Paul wakes up screaming from a nightmare. Victoria comforts him just as the bells ring. Frost has hit the vineyard. Everyone rushes outside. Frost can destroy an entire year's harvest overnight. Workers ignite pipes to pull warm air across the vines. Paul asks how he can help, but Alberto tells him to step aside. Victoria shows him how to use large cloths to help spread the heat. Paul copies her movements, determined and focused. By morning, the vines are saved. Before Paul can leave, Don Pedro takes him to the vineyard's oldest site, a hill where their ancestor planted the first vine in the 1500s. He tells Paul that an orphan is simply someone waiting to discover their family, and invites Paul to consider the Aragons as his own. Paul is moved, but still insists on leaving. Don Pedro reveals that Alberto already predicted he'd run away and Victoria will suffer for it, so Paul decides to stay one more day. The next day feels magical. Harvest is a celebration. Victoria's brother Pedro arrives from Stanford. The workers sing, and everyone picks grapes together. Paul studies Alberto's movements and even ends up in a silent competition with him. To everyone's surprise, they finish their grape loads at the same time. The mood shifts into celebration. The women step into a huge wooden vat to crush grapes with their feet. Victoria joins, and the women pull Paul in too. Amid the laughter, music, and grape juice, Paul and Victoria dance. They move closer, drawn to each other. Later, alone and still soaked from the vat, they share a passionate kiss. But Paul jerks away, pained. He admits that he loves her more than he ever expected, but he is married. He cannot betray her or his wife. Victoria sobs into the night. Paul sleeps alone, feeling crushed by his own sense of duty. The next morning, Paul wakes to Pedro and Alberto arguing. Pedro wants to modernize the winery. Paul suggests bank loans as backup during bad seasons. Alberto snaps, telling Paul to mind his business. He also comments that Paul and Victoria don't act like a real married couple, especially after Paul slept on the sofa. Paul defends Victoria, saying her well-being matters to him deeply. Suddenly, Victoria clutches her stomach in pain. Paul rushes to help, but she insists this isn't his responsibility anymore. She walks off. Paul follows, but instead runs into Alberto again. Alberto angrily reminds Paul he'll never own the vineyard, and Paul fires back, asking whether Alberto even loves his daughter. Alberto insists he does. Paul tells him to start showing it. Victoria overhears the whole thing. Don Pedro finds Paul and shares homemade brandy with him. They get drunk and sentimental. Don Pedro teaches Paul a romantic song so he can serenade Victoria. With a mariachi band behind him, Paul sings beneath her window with raw, broken earnestness. Every family member listens. Even Alberto begins to question his judgment of Paul. If Victoria accepts the serenade, she will turn on her bedroom lamp. The song ends. The window stays dark. Devastated, Paul walks away, but then the lamp finally flickers on. Still, Paul chooses duty and prepares to leave. Paul ends up at the Harvest Festival the next day because his bus leaves from that area. Victoria sees him and approaches with 2 glasses of wine. Alberto walks over proudly, introduces Paul to the priest as his son-in-law, and announces a wedding that evening. Shocked, Paul tells Victoria they can't continue this lie. She agrees. Before she returns to her family, he gives her his Bronze Star medal for her unborn child. Victoria then confesses everything to her father. She is pregnant, and Paul is not the father. Paul quietly leaves the festival. He hitchhikes to Florida to face Betty. When he walks into the apartment, he finds Betty in bed with another man. She calmly says that the life he wants is not the life she wants. She has already filed their annulment papers and wants him to sign. Paul leaves stunned, but joy creeps into his heart. He's finally free. He hitchhikes back toward Napa as fast as he can. Paul returns to Los Nubes at night. Alberto, drunk and bitter, wakes up when Paul demands permission to marry Victoria and raise her child. Alberto rages again and hurls an oil lamp. It misses Paul but ignites a tree. Then another, and suddenly the whole vineyard is on fire. Paul acts fast, dunking his jacket in water and beating the flames. The family and workers rush in to help. Pedro's clothes catch fire. Paul sprints to him, wraps him in wet cloth, and saves him. Despite everyone's efforts, the entire vineyard burns to the ground by morning. The Aragon family collapses in grief. Don Pedro mourns not just the season's harvest, but the symbolic heart of their ancestry, the ancient vine on the hill. They assume it's gone forever. While the family cries, Paul climbs the hill alone with a shovel. He digs through ash until he finds the charred root of the ancient vine. It looks dead, black and hopeless, but he brings it down to Alberto anyway and tells him to cut into it. Alberto slices away the burnt bark and gasps. The quarry's still alive. Hope floods the entire family. Don Pedro cries with joy. Lost noobs can be reborn. Alberto finally understands Paul's heart. He thanks him, embraces him, and cuts a living piece from the vine for Paul to replant, not as a visitor, not as a helper, but as family. In a beautiful, quiet moment, Paul takes Victoria's hand and places a real ring on her finger. The family cheers through tears as the two kiss. Paul, the orphan soldier who returned from war believing he had nothing, finally finds everything he ever dreamed of: love, family, and a home among the clouds. And that wraps up the full story of A Walk in the Clouds. If you enjoyed this recap and want more cinematic deep dives like this, don't forget to hit that like button. Drop a comment about your favorite moment from the film, and subscribe to Movie Recaps Hub podcast for more storytelling style movie breakdowns. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.